April 16th, 2020. A phone rings in a luxury apartment somewhere in Italy. Vasily Khristoforov, known throughout Russia's criminal underworld as Vasya Voskres, stares at his encrypted device. His lawyer, one of the most expensive attorneys in Moscow, has just demanded $300,000 to make a fabricated police investigation disappear. Most thieves-in-law would handle this the old way, a meeting in a deserted warehouse, perhaps a shallow grave in the forest outside the city. But Voskres does something that violates every principle of the criminal code he's sworn to uphold. He tells his representative to call the Federal Security Service of Russia, the FSB, the direct successor to the KGB, the organization that has hunted men like him for decades. Within hours, Russia's most powerful intelligence agency begins monitoring every communication, setting up a sting operation not to catch the criminal boss, but to protect him. This is the story of the only thief-in-law in Russian history whom the FSB ever defended. The nickname itself was born from dark prison humor. Vasily Alexandrovich Khristoforov entered this world in 1972 in Dzerzhinsk, an industrial city in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, known for its chemical plants and grinding poverty. His surname, Khristoforov, derives from Christ. In Orthodox tradition, Easter morning brings the greeting Christos Voskres, Christ is risen. Someone in the criminal underworld noticed the similarity, and the name stuck. Vasya Voskres. Vasya has risen. For over 20 years, this ironic religious reference would become one of the most feared brands in Russian organized crime. But there was a problem, a fundamental flaw that should have destroyed his criminal career before it began. In 1989, just before his scheduled conscription into the Soviet Army, 18-year-old Vasily received his first conviction: 1 year probation for giving false testimony in a criminal case. This conviction determined his military assignment. Instead of a regular unit, the Dzerzhinsk military commissariat sent him to a construction battalion, a Stroybat. For 2 years, from 1989 to 1991, Vasily Khristoforov dug ditches, mixed concrete, and wielded shovels rather than weapons. He never held an automatic rifle. He was, in criminal slang, an avtomatchik, a serviceman. This matters because in the Thieves' Code, the Vorovskoy Zakon, military service is an unforgivable sin. The code explicitly forbids cooperation with state authority. Serving in the army, even involuntarily, means you've submitted to government control, worn a state uniform, followed state orders. Men have been brutally beaten, expelled from the criminal brotherhood, even killed for less. The punishment is called a progon, a stripping ceremony where your status as a thief-in-law is publicly revoked. You become an outcast, fair game for anyone who wants to collect a debt or settle a score. Yet somehow, impossibly, Vasily Khristoforov would not only survive this fatal flaw, but rise to manage the entire treasury of Russia's criminal underworld. The question of how consumed the criminal world for years. Behind closed doors, rivals whispered the insult avtomatchik with barely concealed contempt. But never to his face, never where Vasya Voskres could hear. The answer lay in what happened after his military service ended in 1991. The Soviet Union was collapsing, the old order was dying, and young Vasily returned to Dzerzhinsk with new connections forged in the construction battalion, where criminals, political dissidents, and unlucky conscripts mixed freely. He knew how systems worked, how to exploit bureaucratic chaos, how to navigate between the legal and illegal worlds. In 1993, 2 years after his discharge, Voskres committed the crime that would, paradoxically, launch his criminal career. He and several accomplices robbed a driver of a Volga automobile. Simple enough. Cars were valuable currency in the chaotic 1990s. But during the investigation, police discovered the Volga wasn't privately owned. It belonged to an organization, making the theft appropriation of state property on an especially large scale. The distinction multiplied his sentence from petty theft to major crime. The Dzerzhinsk court sentenced him to 6 years in a strict regime colony. For many young criminals, prison is where careers end. But for those seeking to join the thieves in law, prison is graduate school. It's where you prove yourself, where you learn the code, where the authorities who actually matter, the criminal authorities, evaluate whether you have what it takes. Voskres began his sentence at Colony IK4 in the settlement of Burepolom, Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. The facility housed mostly economic criminals and thieves, the kind of prisoners who understood the unwritten rules of criminal hierarchy. Voskres studied these rules obsessively. He learned which prisoners commanded respect and why. He learned the elaborate system of castes, the thieves, the men, the goats who cooperated with administration, the offended who occupied the lowest rung. He learned the proper way to speak, to carry himself, to resolve disputes. From IK4, authorities transferred him to Colony IK9 in Dzerzhinsk itself, closer to home. Then came a promotion of sorts, transfer to Dzerzhinsk City Prison, and finally to Chistopol Prison in Tatarstan, one of Russia's most notorious maximum security facilities. Chistopol houses the most dangerous criminals in the country: serial killers, terrorists, organized crime figures. It's also where the thieves-in-law maintain their strongest presence. Years later, leaked video footage from Chistopol would reveal something extraordinary about Voskres's time there. His cell was completely covered with expensive carpets. On the walls, the ceiling, creating an almost residential atmosphere utterly foreign to Russian prison standards. The videos showed a young man moving confidently through this carpeted space, clearly accustomed to authority. How did these luxury items enter a maximum security prison? Who authorized it? The footage never explained, but the message was clear. Even behind bars, Vasily Khristoforov wielded influence. It was in Chistopol that Voskres achieved a crucial milestone. He became a smotrashchi, a watcher, an overseer. In Russian prisons, watchers are the thieves' representatives who maintain order, collect tribute for the obshchak, the communal criminal fund, and resolve disputes according to criminal law rather than prison regulations. The position requires absolute trust from the thieves-in-law who appoint you. It means you're being evaluated for higher things. Voskres served his full sentence, refusing to seek early release through cooperation with authorities. This, too, mattered. When he walked out of Chistopol in 1999, he had a sterling criminal resume. Multiple convictions, years in strict regime facilities, proven leadership in prison, and, crucially, he had never once cooperated with the state. The military service remained a problem, yes, but perhaps one that could be overlooked given everything else. The late 1990s in Russia were the wild years, the time of the oligarchs and the bandit capitalism that followed Soviet collapse. In Nizhny Novgorod, criminal groups battled for control of factories, shipping routes, protection rackets. The old Soviet-era black marketeers were being replaced by younger, more violent men who understood that the government's monopoly on violence had temporarily evaporated. Dzerzhinsk and neighboring cities hosted numerous criminal authorities, each controlling different territories and businesses. By the early 2000s, sources suggest 6 established thieves-in-law coexisted relatively peacefully in the Nizhny Novgorod region, having divided the territory among themselves. The names included Vadik Bely, Vladislav Leontiev, Vagon, Vladimir Vagain, and Seka, Razhivin, who lived on a street adjacent to where Voskres's family resided. This network of criminal authorities noticed the young ex-convict. Voskres had something they valued. He was smart. He understood business and bureaucracy, and he had proven himself in prison. More importantly, he had connections to a rising power in Moscow's criminal world. The clan of Aslan Usoyan, known as Dead Hasan, Grandfather Hasan. Dead Hasan was a legendary figure, an ethnic Yazidi Kurd who had risen to dominate much of Moscow's organized crime. His influence extended across the former Soviet Union. When Dead Hasan spoke, criminals listened. And in the year 2000, Dead Hasan and his principal lieutenant, Zakary Kalashov, known as Shakro the Young or Shakro Molodoy, were looking to expand their influence in Russia's regions. They needed local representatives they could trust. The year 2001 became the turning point. Somewhere in Russia, sources don't specify the exact location, the criminal underworld's elite gathered for a coronation ceremony. These events are shrouded in secrecy, known only through later court testimonies and informant reports. What is known is that a remarkable group of thieves-in-law assembled to evaluate 29-year-old Vasily Khristoforov. The Nizhny Novgorod contingent came in force. Vadik Beli, Vagon, and Seka represented the local authorities who had mentored Voskres. But the real power sat on the other side of the room. Dead Hasan himself attended, the 64-year-old crime boss whose word could make or break criminal careers. Beside him sat Shakro the Young, then only 37, but already feared throughout Russia's underworld. Gia Georgadze, a pure-blooded Georgian thief known as Gia, rounded out the Caucasian contingent. The ceremony followed ancient tradition. Voskres would have knelt before these authorities. They would have questioned him about his criminal past, his time in prison, his understanding of the thieves' code, and, inevitably, someone would have raised the military service issue. How could a man who served in the Soviet Stroybat become a thief-in-law? Voskres's defense was simple. He never held a weapon. He dug ditches and mixed concrete, nothing more. He was essentially a prison laborer in uniform, not a true soldier. Whether this argument convinced everyone is doubtful. More likely, Dead Hasan and Shakro simply decided that Voskres's other qualities outweighed this flaw. They needed smart, capable men in Nizhny Novgorod. They needed someone who could manage money, navigate legitimate business, and maintain discipline. Voskres could do all of that. The vote went in his favor. Vasily Khristoforov became a vor v zakone, a thief-in-law, crowned with the blessing of some of the most powerful criminals in Russia. He received his nickname officially, Vasya Voskres. And with that crown came responsibilities and opportunities that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The irony of that 2001 gathering would become apparent over the following years. Of the major figures who crowned Voskres, nearly all would end up dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. Dead Hasan would be assassinated in 2013 outside a Moscow restaurant, cut down by a sniper's bullet. Shakro the Young would face multiple arrests and trials. Vadik Beli would die in Cyprus in 2021. But Vasya Voskres, the man with the fatal flaw who should never have been crowned in the first place, would survive and prosper. His first test came quickly. In Nizhny Novgorod's criminal underworld, the arrival of a newly crowned thief disrupted the careful balance of power. A seventh thief-in-law, Novik, Novikov, was released from prison and returned to the city. 7 thieves in one region was too many. Someone had to go. Voskres handled it personally and brutally. He accused Novik of drug addiction, a serious violation of the criminal code. Whether the accusation was true didn't particularly matter. What mattered was that Voskres had the backing of Moscow's powerful Dead Hasan clan. He physically beat Novik and then, in front of other criminals, declared him not a thief. This public stripping ceremony, a progon, meant Novik was expelled from the criminal elite. His protection vanished. His authority evaporated. He became just another ex-convict with a dangerous past and no future. The message was clear. The young thief from Dzerzhinsk had real power behind him. But October 2003 brought a test that couldn't be solved through criminal politics. A local entrepreneur named Alexander Pokrovsky operated businesses in Sarov, a closed nuclear city in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. The details of the dispute remain murky. Competing protection rackets, business partnerships gone wrong, unpaid debts. What's clear is that the conflict exploded into violence in downtown Dzerzhinsk. Multiple criminal groups engaged in a massive brawl that included gunfire. Witnesses described chaos in the city center, criminals firing weapons in broad daylight. Such brazen violence couldn't be ignored, even in 1990s Russia, where police often looked the other way. But the response was characteristically slow. Not until May 2005, nearly 2 years later, did authorities arrest Vasya Voskres in connection with the Sarov incident. Prosecutors demanded 6.5 years in prison. The evidence was apparently substantial: multiple witnesses, weapons charges, organized violence. Voskres employed a strategy common among Russian criminals facing prosecution. He invoked Article 51 of the Russian Constitution, the equivalent of the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Throughout the trial, he refused to answer questions, maintaining absolute silence. Let the prosecutors prove their case without his help. His wife mounted a defense that appealed to the court's humanity rather than legal technicalities. She reminded the judges that Vasily Khristoforov was a father of 2 young children. What would happen to these children if their father disappeared into prison for years? The argument carried weight in a legal system where judges retained substantial discretion in sentencing. The outcome of this specific trial remains unclear in available sources, but what's certain is that Voskres didn't disappear into long-term incarceration. By the mid-2000s, he was actively operating in Nizhny Novgorod's criminal world, his status as a thief-in-law secure despite the military service whispers that never quite died. More importantly, his relationship with Dead Hasan and Shakro deepened. The Moscow crime bosses recognized that Voskres had qualities beyond simple muscle. He understood finance, accounting, the movement of money through legal and illegal channels. In the criminal underworld, this knowledge was worth more than any amount of street violence. The thieves-in-law maintain a communal treasury called the Obshchak, fed by tributes from criminal groups across Russia and abroad. Money flows into the Obshchak from protection rackets, drug trafficking, theft, fraud, and countless other enterprises. This money funds operations, bribing officials, supporting imprisoned thieves and their families, financing new criminal ventures. Managing the Obshchak requires absolute trustworthiness and sophisticated financial skills. Dead Hasan appointed Voskres to help manage portions of the Obshchak. It was an extraordinary responsibility for a relatively young thief. The position meant Voskres would interact with criminal authorities from across Russia and the former Soviet Union. He would know who paid what, who was falling behind on their obligations, who was getting rich, and who was struggling. This knowledge is power in the criminal world. With access to the Obshchak came access to the inner circle. Voskres attended gatherings where the most powerful thieves-in-law discussed strategy, resolved disputes, and made decisions that affected criminal operations across multiple countries. He learned how the system really worked, not the romantic version portrayed in movies, but the brutal reality of men managing violence and money on an industrial scale. His role expanded beyond simple accounting. Dead Hasan used Voskres as an enforcer of criminal law, someone who could strip other thieves of their status when they violated the code. These progons, stripping ceremonies, were essential to maintaining discipline in a world without courts or police. A thief-in-law who stole from the obszczak, who cooperated with authorities, who showed cowardice or violated the fundamental principles, such a man had to be publicly humiliated and expelled. Voskres signed his name to several notorious progons. Tariel Oniani, known as Taro, was one of the most powerful Georgian thieves-in-law, controlling criminal operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. When Taro allegedly violated criminal protocol, Voskres was among those who supported his removal from the thieves' ranks. The politics behind this progon were complex, involving competing Georgian and Slavic factions, but Voskres's signature on the decree demonstrated his growing influence. Rovshan Janiev, known as Rovshan Lankaran, was an Azerbaijani crime boss who controlled significant territory. When the Thieves' Council moved against him, Voskres participated in the expulsion. Vyatlag, Vasin, and Hans, Tishkenkov, two other thieves who ran afoul of Dead Hasan's organization, faced similar treatment. In each case, Voskres's role sent a message. He wasn't just a financial manager. He was a political operator who could destroy criminal careers with a signature. But this power came with risk. The criminal underworld in Russia was never stable, never peaceful for long. Competing factions fought for territory, for prestige, for the right to collect tribute from legitimate businesses forced to pay protection money. And the violence wasn't metaphorical. Thieves-in-law were regularly assassinated, blown up in their cars, shot in restaurants, poisoned in prison. Every day brought the possibility of death. The autumn of 2013 changed everything. On the evening of January 16, 2013, 67-year-old Aslan Usoyan left a restaurant in central Moscow. Dead Hasan, the legend, the man who had crowned Vasya Voskres and dozens of other thieves, walked toward his car surrounded by bodyguards. Somewhere in the darkness, a sniper waited with a rifle. The shot was perfect. Dead Hasan collapsed on the Moscow pavement, dead before his guards could react. The assassination sent shockwaves through Russia's criminal world. Dead Hasan had seemed untouchable, protected by his reputation, his network, his decades of accumulated power. If he could be killed so easily, no one was safe. Immediately, speculation began about who ordered the hit. Rival Georgian factions? Chechen criminals? Russian law enforcement eliminating a target? The truth remained murky, lost in competing theories and revenge plots. For Vasya Voskres, Dead Hasan's death meant losing a crucial protector. The man who had overlooked his military service, who had given him access to the obszczak, who had elevated him into the criminal elite. Gone in a single rifle shot. Voskres needed new alliances, and he needed them fast. He turned to Zakhary Kalashov, Shakro the Young, who was now Shakro Molodoy, no longer quite so young at 50. Shakro had his own troubles. Spanish authorities had arrested him in 2006 on charges related to organized crime and money laundering. He spent years fighting extradition before finally being released and returning to Russia in 2014. When Shakro came back to Moscow, Voskres was among the first to welcome them. The relationship between the two men deepened during this period. Sources indicate Voskres was a frequent visitor to Shakro's cottage outside Moscow, spending hours in consultation with the aging crime boss. Together, they visited Troyekurovskoye Cemetery to pay respects at Dead Hasan's grave. They also visited the burial site of Vyacheslav Ivankov, known as Yaponchik, Little Japanese, another legendary thief who had been shot by a sniper in 2009. These cemetery visits weren't merely sentimental. In the criminal world, showing respect to dead authorities demonstrates continuity, loyalty to the old codes. It signals to other criminals that you honor tradition, even as you build new power structures. Voskres and Shakro were positioning themselves as the inheritors of dead Hasan's legacy. But Shakro's troubles weren't over. Russian authorities, emboldened by new legislation targeting organized crime, began building cases against the country's most prominent thieves-in-law. In 2016, investigators arrested Shakro Molodoy, charging him with organizing criminal activities, extortion, and related offenses. The trial would drag on for years, but it was clear that Shakro would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. This created a vacuum at the top of Russia's criminal hierarchy. Shakro had been the unquestioned leader, the Vor Nomer Odin, thief number one, the boss of all bosses. With him behind bars awaiting trial, someone needed to manage the Obshchak, hear petitions from criminal groups across Russia, make decisions about disputes and territory. The criminal world couldn't simply stop functioning because its leader was in prison. Shakro chose Vasya Voskres as his temporary replacement. It was an extraordinary appointment. Voskres was younger than many established thieves. His military service remained a source of quiet criticism, and he lacked the battlefield credentials of men who had fought in prison riots or survived assassination attempts. But Shakro trusted him with the Treasury, and that trust was what mattered. For months in 2017 and early 2018, Vasya Voskres functioned as the acting boss of all Russian thieves. Criminal authorities from across the country traveled to Moscow to meet with him, to present their problems, to seek his judgment on disputes. They brought tribute for the Obshchak, cash, percentages from drug deals, cuts from protection rackets. Voskres documented everything, maintained the accounts, ensured the money flowed to where it needed to go. Bribes for corrupt officials, support for imprisoned thieves, funding for new criminal enterprises. It was during this period that Voskres demonstrated a quality unusual among thieves-in-law: political restraint. He could have fought to make his temporary position permanent. He had the Treasury. He had Shakro's endorsement. He had relationships with criminal authorities across Russia and abroad. But he also understood the dangers of ambition in a world where rivals settled disputes with bullets and bombs. The criminal underworld was fracturing along ethnic lines. The old unity that dead Hasan had maintained between Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Chechen, and Russian thieves was breaking down. The Caucasian factions, Georgians, Armenians, Kurds, had historically dominated the thieves-in-law hierarchy. But Slavic Russian criminals increasingly resented this dominance, arguing that Russian thieves should control Russian territory. When the time came to elect a new supreme Vor, Voskres didn't position himself as a candidate. Instead, he supported Yuri Pichugin, known as Pichuga, a powerful Slavic thief with deep roots in the criminal traditions. Pichugin had been crowned in the mid-1990s and had served as one of dead Hasan's key lieutenants, representing the Slavic wing of the organization. He seemed like a logical choice to unify the competing factions, but in February 2017, before any formal selection could occur, Russian police arrested Pichugin in the Komi Republic, along with 7 of his associates. The charges were serious: organizing criminal activities under Russia's new anti-organized crime statutes. Pichugin's arrest eliminated him from consideration for leadership. The criminal council that eventually gathered to select a new supreme Vor faced a difficult choice. The leading candidates represented different factions, different regions, different visions for the future of Russian organized crime. After extensive negotiations, they selected Oleg Shishkanov, known as Shishkan. Shishkan represented a significant shift in power. He was purely Slavic Russian, with no ties to the Caucasian factions that had dominated the thieves' world for decades. His selection meant that the Russian wing of the criminal underworld had finally captured the top position from the Georgians and Armenians who had held it since Soviet times. This wasn't just a personnel change. It was a fundamental realignment of criminal power in Russia. Vasya Voskres accepted the decision without apparent resistance. He had supported Putin, yes, but he didn't wage a political campaign against Shishkin. Instead, he quietly stepped back from the spotlight, remaining in Shishkin's inner circle, but no longer functioning as the acting supreme authority. This restraint likely saved his life. In the years following Shishkin's elevation, several thieves-in-law who had competed for the supreme position met violent ends. Cars exploded, snipers fired through apartment windows, prison fights turned deadly. The criminal underworld was settling its succession disputes through traditional means: murder. But Voskres, who had held supreme power temporarily and then surrendered it willingly, remained untouched. He had something else in mind anyway. The position of supreme vor attracted attention, from rival criminals, from law enforcement, from intelligence services. Every decision you made created enemies. Every ruling on a dispute meant someone felt cheated. The supreme vor lived under constant threat of assassination or arrest. Managing the obshchak, on the other hand, provided power without the same level of exposure. As the keeper of the criminal treasury, Voskres knew everyone's financial situations, their debts, their income streams. He could facilitate deals, arrange loans from the obshchak, punish those who failed to pay tribute. This power was quieter than being supreme vor, but in many ways more durable. More importantly, he began spending extended time outside Russia. Italy, with its Mediterranean climate, its luxury goods, its relatively lax enforcement of Russian arrest warrants, became a favored destination. The Italian authorities had a long history of tolerating Russian organized crime figures, as long as they didn't commit crimes on Italian soil. Voskres could live comfortably in Italy while managing Russian criminal finances remotely through encrypted communications and trusted representatives. His primary representative in Russia was Stanislav Vorotnikov, a businessman with connections to both legitimate enterprises and the criminal underworld. Vorotnikov could attend meetings, collect tribute, handle day-to-day operations, while Voskres directed strategy from abroad. This arrangement provided safety. Russian law enforcement couldn't easily arrest someone operating from Italy, while maintaining control. By 2019 and early 2020, Vasya Voskres had achieved something remarkable in the criminal world. He had survived. Most of the thieves who had crowned him in 2001 were dead. Dead Hasan, assassinated. Yaponchik, assassinated. Vadik Bili would die of a stroke in Cyprus in 2021, but by 2020, he was already fading from relevance. Shakro Molodoy sat in a Russian prison, fighting a legal battle he would likely lose. Gaya Gergadze had died. The entire generation of crime bosses who had dominated the post-Soviet underworld was disappearing. But Voskres endured, managing money from a safe distance, avoiding the violence and the arrests that claimed so many of his peers. He had learned the fundamental lesson that many thieves-in-law never grasp. Sometimes the smartest move is not to be the most powerful, but to be the one who survives. His Italian arrangement seemed perfect. Russia's chaotic political situation, the increasing pressure on organized crime from both law enforcement and Chechen security forces loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov, made Moscow dangerous for high-level thieves. Italy offered stability, safety, a comfortable lifestyle. Voskres could enjoy Mediterranean beaches, fine restaurants, luxury shopping, all while managing criminal operations back in Russia through encrypted phones and trusted intermediaries. Then, in late February 2020, His phone rang with a call that would shatter this comfortable arrangement. On the line was Alexander Vershinin, his lawyer. And Vershinin had very disturbing news about a criminal investigation that supposedly threatened Voskres with extradition and life in prison. What Vasya Voskres didn't know yet was that the entire thing was a scam. And what he especially didn't know was that his response to this scam would make him the only thief-in-law in Russian history whom the Federal Security Service would actively protect. February 26, 2020. Moscow. Evening. Alexander Vershinin's phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in 6 years. Alexei Dobrynin, a real estate developer from the Moscow suburbs, was calling. The two men had known each other casually, having met during the 2014 Sochi Olympics, when Russia was still basking in the glow of hosting the Winter Games. They hadn't spoken since. "Sasha, I need to see you urgently," Dobrynin said. "It's about Vasya, your client." Vershinin knew immediately which Vasya. He had represented Vasily Khristoforov, Vasya Voskres, on various legal matters over the years. Defending thieves-in-law was lucrative work. They paid cash, they paid well, and they rarely asked questions about billing rates. Vershinin had built a stellar career representing not just criminals, but also Russia's elite. Alexei Ulukayev, former Minister of Economic Development who was convicted of bribery. Mikhail Abizov, a businessman and former government minister arrested on massive fraud charges. Vershinin's reputation as a fixer, a lawyer who could make problems disappear, commanded premium fees. They agreed to meet that evening. When Dobrynin arrived at the meeting location, he wasn't alone. He introduced his companion as Vladislav, describing him as an active officer in the Main Directorate of Criminal Investigation, GUUR, part of Russia's Ministry of Internal Affairs. This was the elite unit that investigated organized crime, corruption, major theft rings. Except Vladislav wasn't an active police officer. His real name was Vladislav Shapovalov, and he had indeed once been a lieutenant colonel in GUUR. But he had retired from the police force and now worked as general director of a Moscow construction company called Stroykomplekt. Still, he looked the part. Confident, authoritative, speaking in the clipped jargon of law enforcement. Shapovalov pulled out documents, official-looking papers with stamps and signatures, operational reports, internal memos. According to these materials, GUR had been conducting a long-term investigation into Vasily Khristoforov under Article 210 of the Russian Criminal Code, Organization of a Criminal Community, and Article 172, Illegal Banking Activity. The documents suggested investigators had gathered extensive evidence of Voskres's role in managing the criminal obshchak, collecting tribute from legitimate businesses, organizing criminal activities across multiple regions. The papers looked genuine. They had the right format, the right bureaucratic language, the right official stamps. Vershinin, despite his years of experience, couldn't immediately spot them as forgeries. Shapovalov explained that the investigation was reaching its final stage. Arrest warrants were being prepared. Extradition requests would be filed with Italian authorities. Vasya Voskres would be returned to Russia in chains. But, Shapovalov suggested, there might be a way to make this all go away. For $300,000, the investigation could be quietly closed. The evidence could disappear. The case could die from lack of documentation. $300,000 was nothing compared to what Voskres would lose: his freedom, his assets, his entire criminal empire. Vershinin asked to photograph the documents with his phone. Dobrynin refused. Too risky. What if someone hacked Vershinin's phone? What if the FSB was monitoring communications? But he promised to send digital copies through secure channels. For now, Vershinin should call Vasya, explain the situation, gauge his willingness to pay. The lawyer stepped away and dialed the encrypted number for Voskres in Italy. The thief-in-law answered. Vershinin explained the situation. GUUR investigation, serious charges, possible extradition. Then he handed the phone to Dobrinin, who repeated the story directly. Voskres listened carefully, asked a few questions, then told Vershinin to handle it. They would talk more after the lawyer had reviewed all the evidence. A few days later, Dobrinin sent the documents through Telegram, the encrypted messaging app popular in Russia. Vershinin examined them more carefully. The materials detailed supposed operations against Voskres, surveillance reports, financial analysis of the Obshchak, witness statements from criminals who had allegedly cooperated with investigators. The sheer volume of documentation was impressive. Vershinin shared the files with Voskres. The thief studied them from Italy, probably with assistance from people who understood law enforcement procedures. The documents were concerning, but something felt wrong. Why would an active GUUR officer risk his career to sell information about an ongoing investigation? How did a real estate developer get access to these classified materials? Why the urgency? But the charges themselves were plausible. Russian authorities had indeed passed new anti-thief legislation in recent years, making it a crime simply to hold the title of Vor v Zakon or to participate in the criminal hierarchy. Several thieves-in-law had been arrested and convicted under these statutes. An investigation into Vasya Voskres wasn't impossible. Still, $300,000 was an enormous sum, even for someone managing millions in the criminal Obshchak. Voskres told Vershinin the price was absurd. If the investigation was real, they would fight it through legitimate legal channels. If it was a shakedown, they weren't paying. This response surprised Shapovalov and Dobrinin. They had expected Voskres to negotiate, to bargain the price down perhaps, but ultimately to pay. Thieves-in-law valued their freedom above almost everything. $300,000 to avoid years in a Russian prison seemed like a bargain. But Voskres wasn't playing along. Shapovalov tried different pressure tactics. He emphasized the seriousness of the charges. He suggested that once the arrest warrant was issued, negotiation would be impossible. He implied that the price might go up if Voskres delayed. But the thief remained skeptical. Then, Vasya Voskres made a decision that violated every principle of the thieves' code. He instructed Stanislav Vorotnikov, his representative in Moscow, to contact the Federal Security Service and report the extortion attempt. Think about what this meant. The FSB is the direct successor to the Soviet KGB. It's Russia's primary intelligence and counterintelligence agency. It monitors domestic threats, investigates terrorism, hunts foreign spies, and works to destroy organized crime networks. For decades, the FSB and its predecessor agencies had fought a shadow war against the thieves-in-law. They had arrested thieves, infiltrated criminal organizations, turned members into informants. In the criminal code, cooperating with the FSB was perhaps the gravest possible violation, worse even than theft from the Obshchak or cowardice in prison. Yet Voskres calculated that this particular situation was different. The extortion attempt wasn't coming from rival criminals, but from corrupt former law enforcement trying to exploit his status. If real GUUR officers were investigating him, he would handle it through lawyers and normal channels. But if this was a scam, then the scammers were impersonating police officers, which was itself a serious crime. The FSB would be interested in corrupt former officers defrauding people using fake police credentials. Vorotnikov made the contact. FSB officers met with him, reviewed the documentation that had been sent via telegram, assessed the situation. They quickly determined the investigation was fabricated. No genuine GUUR operation existed targeting Vasya Voskres. The documents were skillful forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. Shapovalov had used his knowledge of police procedures and documentation to create convincing fakes. The FSB made a decision that shocked everyone involved. They would protect Vasya Voskres and catch the extortionists. This wasn't about helping a criminal. This was about catching corrupt former law enforcement officers who were damaging the credibility of Russia's police and security services. If ex-cops could successfully impersonate active investigators and extort people, it undermined the entire system. FSB technical specialists began monitoring all communications between the conspirators and Voskres's representatives. Every telegram message, every phone call, every meeting was tracked. The security service built a comprehensive case, documenting exactly how the scheme worked, who was involved, what they were demanding. Shapovalov, Dobrynin, and Vershinin had no idea they were being monitored. They continued their pressure campaign, sending additional fake documents, arranging meetings, negotiating the payment terms. At some point, perhaps sensing that straight extortion wasn't working, they adjusted their approach. Instead of demanding payment to stop an investigation, they framed it as a legitimate fee for Vershinin's legal services in making the case go away. By mid-April 2020, after weeks of negotiations, they had arranged for payment. Vershinin would receive the money from Vorotnikov, Voskres's representative. The lawyer would keep a portion as his fee and pass the rest to Shapovalov and Dobrynin. The meeting was set for April 16, 2020, at 3 Mali Prospect in Moscow. April 16th was exactly 1 week before Vershinin's 50th birthday. He had built a remarkable career, representing some of Russia's most powerful people, earning enormous fees, enjoying the lifestyle that comes with defending oligarchs and ministers. He had a reputation, connections, a future. All of it was about to end. That afternoon, Vershinin arrived at the designated location. Vorotnikov was waiting with a package, cash, $300,000, bundled and ready. The FSB had provided the money, marked bills that could be traced. Cameras were rolling. FSB operatives were positioned throughout the area, watching, waiting. Vershinin took the package. He turned toward his car. And suddenly, FSB officers surrounded the vehicle. Guns drawn, commands shouted. Vershinin froze, the money still in his hands. The arrest was textbook. Overwhelming force, no chance for resistance or escape. Within hours, FSB teams arrested Shapovalov and Dobrynin. All 3 conspirators were charged under Article 159 of the Russian Criminal Code, fraud, or, in Shapovalov's case, attempted fraud given his role in initiating the scheme. The investigation had recordings of their conversations, copies of the fake documents, documentation of the money transfer, everything needed for conviction. The legal proceedings revealed the full scope of the operation. Shapovalov had created the fake GUUR documents using templates and knowledge from his years in law enforcement. He knew exactly how operational reports should look, what language investigators used, how to forge stamps and signatures convincingly. Dobrynin served as the messenger, the person who could credibly claim to have connections to active police officers. Vershinin was supposed to be the trusted intermediary who could collect money from Voskres without arousing suspicion. Their mistake was assuming Voskres would react like a typical criminal, panicked, desperate to avoid arrest, willing to pay enormous sums to make problems disappear. They didn't anticipate that he would verify the information, that he would contact the FSB, that he would cooperate with security services to trap the extortionists. The trials moved through Russia's court system. Shapovalov, as the primary organizer, faced the most serious charges. Prosecutors presented evidence of his fabricated documents, his fake claims about being an active police officer, his demands for payment. His defense argued that he had never actually been an active officer at the time, so technically he wasn't impersonating police, merely exaggerating his connections. The argument failed. In February 2021, Nikolinsky District Court in Moscow sentenced Vladislav Shapovalov to 3 years in a general regime prison colony. The judge found him guilty of attempted fraud on an especially large scale. 3 years wasn't a devastating sentence. He would likely serve less with good behavior. But his reputation was destroyed. An ex-GUUR lieutenant colonel, caught running an extortion racket, would have no future in security or law enforcement. The trial also revealed an interesting detail about the supposed investigation. When questioned, Shapovalov admitted that he had fabricated all the documents. There was no GUUR investigation into Vasya Voskres. No surveillance, no witnesses, no evidence collection. The entire thing was fiction, designed to scare a criminal into paying money he didn't actually owe. Dobrynin's trial came next. The real estate developer had presented himself as a legitimate businessman with police connections. The court found otherwise. He had knowingly participated in an extortion scheme, serving as a courier for fake documents and a negotiator for payment. In June 2021, he received 3.5 years in a general regime colony, slightly more than Shapovalov because prosecutors argued he had been more actively involved in the actual extortion demands. Alexander Vershinin's case was perhaps the most significant because of his prominence. He wasn't some retired cop or small-time developer. He was one of Russia's most famous lawyers, a man who had defended government ministers, oligarchs, major criminals. His fall was spectacular and public. The prosecution argued that Vershinin had violated his oath as an attorney, using his position of trust with Voskres to facilitate a criminal scheme. He had presented false evidence to his client, demanded payment for fake services, and attempted to defraud a man who had hired him for legal protection. The irony was perfect. The lawyer hired to protect Voskres from law enforcement became the threat from which Voskres needed protection. Vershinin's defense was creative. His lawyers argued that he genuinely believed the GUUR investigation was real, that he was acting in good faith to help his client, that when he collected the money, he intended it as a legitimate legal fee for services he would render. The argument had a fundamental problem. The recordings of his conversations with Shapovalov and Dobrynin showed he knew the investigation was fabricated. In June 2021, the same court sentenced Alexander Vershinin to 2.5 years in a general regime colony. Additionally, the court stripped him of his right to practice law for 3 years. His career was over. A man who had earned millions representing Russia's elite would now spend years in a prison colony, labeled a criminal, his reputation destroyed forever. The sentences were relatively light by Russian standards. Fraud on this scale could have meant 5 to 7 years or more. But all 3 defendants were first-time offenders on these particular charges. They cooperated to some degree with investigators, and Russian judges often show leniency when no actual financial loss occurred. Voskres never paid the money, so technically the fraud was attempted rather than completed. Still, the legal outcome was secondary to the broader implications. For the first time in known history, the Federal Security Service of Russia had actively protected a thief-in-law from criminals trying to exploit him. The FSB had provided operational support, surveillance, even the money used in the sting operation. They had treated Vasya Voskres not as a target, but as a victim deserving protection. This cooperation shattered conventional understanding of how Russian security services and organized crime interact. Yes, there had always been rumors of corrupt FSB officers who took bribes from criminals, who warned them about investigations, who provided protection in exchange for cash. But this was different. This was institutional FSB support at an operational level, sanctioned by supervisors, documented in official case files. Several theories emerged to explain this unprecedented alliance. The simplest was that the FSB genuinely cared about stopping corrupt former law enforcement from defrauding people using fake police credentials, and Voskres's criminal status was irrelevant to that mission. This explanation had merit. The FSB does investigate police corruption, and the scheme really did undermine public trust in law enforcement. A more cynical theory suggested that Voskres had been cooperating with the FSB for years, providing information about rival criminals, helping security services map the structure of Russian organized crime. In exchange, the FSB protected him from prosecution and helped him eliminate threats. This would explain his survival while so many other thieves-in-law were assassinated or imprisoned. The darkest theory was that the Russian security services had effectively taken control of portions of organized crime, using thieves-in-law as proxies to manage criminal activity that the state found useful or at least tolerable. In this view, Voskres wasn't an independent criminal, but a managed asset, allowed to operate as long as he served state interests. Whatever the truth, the outcome was clear. Vasya Voskres had survived another threat. His 3 would-be extortionists were in prison. His reputation in the criminal world, far from being damaged by FSB cooperation, was actually enhanced. He had outsmarted corrupt cops, protected the Obshchak's money, and demonstrated that he had connections powerful enough to mobilize Russia's security services. The criminal underworld's reaction was complex. Traditionally, any cooperation with law enforcement meant immediate expulsion and often death. But Voskres hadn't informed on other criminals. He had reported a crime being committed against him by people impersonating police. He had used the system to protect criminal finances from thieves, and in the thieves' code, protecting the Obshchak was sacrosanct. No progon came, no stripping ceremony, no public denouncement. Other thieves-in-law tacitly accepted that what Voskres had done was permissible under the specific circumstances. The alternative, letting corrupt ex-cops steal $300,000 from the Obshchak, would have been worse. This pragmatic acceptance reflected a broader evolution in Russian organized crime. The romantic notion of thieves-in-law as outlaws living entirely outside state control had always been partly fiction. Successful criminals need relationships with law enforcement, intelligence services, political figures. They pay bribes, they provide information, they make deals. The code forbids cooperation, yes, but the code has always been more flexible than the mythology suggests. Vasya Voskres embodied this new reality. He wasn't a traditional thief-in-law from the Soviet era, the kind of man who would rather die than speak to police. He was a modern criminal manager who understood that in Putin's Russia, organized crime exists at the pleasure of the security services. The FSB could destroy any criminal organization it chose. The ones that survived were the ones that proved useful, or at least non-threatening to state interests. After the trials concluded in 2021, Voskres returned to his comfortable existence in Italy. Russian media occasionally mentioned his name in connection with criminal events, but he avoided direct involvement in violence or high-profile crimes. His role remained what it had been: managing money, maintaining the Obshchak, facilitating deals between criminals and legitimate businesses. Current information about Vasya Voskres is limited and contradictory. Some sources suggest he continues to live primarily in Italy, traveling occasionally to Russia through countries that don't honor Russian or international arrest warrants. Others claim he has divided his time between several countries, maintaining residences wherever Russian criminals have established significant presence. What's clear is that he survived into 2024 and beyond, which in itself is remarkable. Of the major figures who attended his 2001 coronation, nearly all are dead or imprisoned. Dead Hasan, assassinated. Shakro Molodoy, serving a long prison sentence. Gia Georgadze, dead. Vadik Beli, dead. Vagon died in prison in 2018 after a heart attack in his cell in Perm region. The entire generation that crowned Voskres has been destroyed by violence, age, or the Russian criminal justice system. Yet the man who should never have been crowned, the avtomatchik who violated the code by serving in the military, endures. His survival suggests either extraordinary luck, exceptional political skills, or protection from sources powerful enough to keep him safe when so many others fell. The FSB incident provides a clue. A thief-in-law who can call on Russia's security services for help when threatened isn't operating in the traditional criminal world anymore. He's functioning in a gray zone where organized crime, state security, and political power intersect. This zone is dangerous, but also potentially safer than being a pure outlaw. The Russian state may destroy independent criminals, but it protects those who serve its interests. Whether Vasya Voskres actively informs on other criminals remains unknown. He may simply be useful in other ways, managing criminal finances that occasionally serve state purposes, maintaining order among criminal groups that might otherwise create chaos, providing a channel through which security services can communicate with the underworld. In Putin's Russia, where the line between state and crime is often blurred, such roles are valuable. The story of Vasya Voskres is ultimately a story about adaptation. He survived by being smarter than the traditional thieves who insisted on absolute adherence to codes written for a different era. He understood that the criminal world had changed, that the old rules no longer guaranteed success or even survival. Military service that should have disqualified him became irrelevant. Violence that other thieves used to maintain authority he avoided when possible. The code that forbid cooperation with authorities he interpreted flexibly enough to save his life and his fortune. In the end, he achieved something rare in the Russian criminal underworld. He got old. Most thieves-in-law die young, killed by rivals or police or their own recklessness. But Vasya Voskres, the Easter resurrection joke who became a criminal brand, survived into his 50s, managing millions, enjoying luxury, watching younger criminals make the mistakes he had learned to avoid. His nickname proved prophetic: Voskres, risen. No matter how many times circumstances threatened to destroy him, he rose again. Military service violation? Risen. Prison sentences? Risen. Assassination threats? Risen. Extortion attempts? Risen. Generation after generation of rival criminals falling around him? Still risen. The only thief-in-law in Russian history whom the FSB protected. The man who called the security services and lived to tell about it. Vasya Voskres, still somewhere in Europe, still managing the Obshchak, still risen. Today, somewhere in Europe, a man in his early 50s lives comfortably in a luxury apartment with Mediterranean views. He dresses well, eats at expensive restaurants, travels frequently. To his neighbors, if they notice him at all, he appears to be a successful businessman, perhaps involved in import-export or consulting. They don't know his real name. They certainly don't know that he manages a criminal treasury worth tens of millions of dollars, that he holds one of the highest ranks in Russian organized crime, or that Russia's Federal Security Service once protected him from extortion. Vasya Voskres represents the final evolution of the Soviet-era thief-in-law. The romantic mythology of the criminal code, the idea of honorable outlaws living by strict principles, rejecting all cooperation with authority, existing in pure opposition to the state, has been revealed as exactly that: mythology. The reality was always more complex, more compromised, more transactional. Consider what has happened to the other major figures in this story. Dead Hasan, the legendary crime boss who crowned Voskres in 2001, was assassinated in 2013. His killer was never definitively identified, though theories pointed to rival Georgian criminals, Chechen enforcers, or even Russian security services eliminating a figure who had become too independent. His death demonstrated that no amount of criminal authority provides protection against a well-placed bullet. Shakro Molodoy, Shakro the Young, received an 18-year prison sentence in 2020 for organizing criminal activities and extortion. The man who once controlled criminal operations across Russia now lives in a prison cell, his empire distributed among younger, hungrier criminals. He will likely die in custody. At 70 years old when his sentence ends, he will be too old to reclaim power, even if released. Yuri Pichugin, the thief Voskres had supported for supreme leadership, remains imprisoned in the Komi Republic. His arrest in 2017 effectively ended any possibility of him unifying the fractured criminal world. The Slavic and Caucasian factions continue their quiet war for dominance, a conflict playing out through proxy battles, strategic assassinations, and competition for control of lucrative criminal enterprises. Oleg Shishkanov, who became Supreme Vor after Pichugin's arrest, faces his own legal troubles. Russian authorities have arrested and released him multiple times, each prosecution seemingly designed more to control him than to actually imprison him permanently. This pattern suggests he too has reached accommodations with Russian security services, trading information and cooperation for relative freedom. Vasya Voskres exemplifies this new breed. He violated the traditional code by serving in the military, yet was crowned anyway. He cooperated with the FSB, yet faced no punishment from other criminals. He avoided the violence and territorial battles that destroyed so many others, focusing instead on financial management and political navigation. His survival isn't despite these violations of tradition, it's because of them. The old thieves-in-law, the men who rigidly adhered to codes developed in Stalin's prison camps, are dead or dying. They couldn't adapt to a world where the Russian state had become too powerful to oppose, where rigid principles meant death or imprisonment, where survival required flexibility and compromise. Some observers argue this represents the death of authentic Russian organized crime, its transformation into something indistinguishable from state-sponsored criminal activity. Others suggest it's simply evolution, the natural adaptation of criminal organizations to changing political environments. The thieves-in-law of the 1990s operated in a power vacuum. The thieves-in-law of the 2020s operate in an authoritarian state. Different circumstances demand different strategies. What's undeniable is that the mythology no longer matches reality. There are no honorable thieves living by ancient codes, rejecting all compromise with authority. There are criminal managers who understand power, who make calculated decisions about when to cooperate and when to resist, who survive by being smarter and more adaptable than their rivals. Vasya Voskres sits in his European apartment, managing the obshak through encrypted communications, making decisions that affect criminal operations across Russia and beyond. He has outlived the legends who crowned him. He has survived assassination attempts, legal threats, internal rivalries. He has demonstrated that in the modern criminal world, intelligence matters more than violence, adaptation more than tradition, and connections more than courage. His story poses uncomfortable questions about the relationship between organized crime and state power in authoritarian systems. When criminals can call security services for protection, when intelligence agencies defend mob bosses, when the line between legitimate authority and criminal enterprise becomes impossible to distinguish, what does that say about the nature of power itself? The answer, perhaps, is that power has always been more about capability and less about legitimacy than we like to admit. The state monopolizes violence not because it's morally superior to criminal organizations, but because it's more powerful. Criminal organizations survive not by opposing the state, but by finding niches where their activities serve state interests, or at least don't threaten them. Vasya Voskres understood this reality earlier and more completely than most of his peers. That understanding, more than any other factor, explains why he's still alive, still free, still managing millions in criminal funds, while so many others are dead or imprisoned. The Easter resurrection joke became a prophecy. Voskres has risen again and again, adapting to each new threat, surviving when survival seemed impossible. Whether he continues rising, or whether age, rivals, or changing political circumstances finally bring him down, his story will remain a testament to the evolution of Russian organized crime, from romantic mythology to pragmatic reality. Somewhere in Italy, the phone rings again. Vasya Voskres answers. Business continues.